In the week following the passing of the ECOWAS deadline to restore democracy, little much has moved. Despite this, the situation is still a concern and yet to be resolved. The Nigerian junta have mostly ignored attempts at diplomacy and has balked at the notion of military intervention, whilst ECOWAS and the West have dug their heels in for Bazoum to be restored. As it stands, Bazoum is still in detention in the basement of the presidential palace, having been so since the day of the coup, with the last time he was seen being the photos released of his meeting with the Chadian president Mohamed Deby. It is thought that Bazoum's health has been in decline, his access to fresh food limited, and is being held alongside his wife and son. Late on Sunday, the Nigerian junta announced that they would be prosecuting Bazoum on charges of high treason and for undermining the internal and external security of the country. Colonel Major Amadou Abdrahman took to national television to read out a statement that said,
En tout état de cause, le gouvernement nigérien a réuni à ce jour les éléments nécessaires de preuve pour poursuivre devant les instances nationales et internationales compétentes le président déchu et ses complices locaux et étrangers pour haute trahison et atteinte à la sûreté intérieure et extérieure du Niger suite à ses échanges avec les nationaux, des chefs d'État étrangers et des responsables d'organisations internationales.
The stance of ECOWAS and the West on the conditions of Bazoum's release and the recognition of only the elected president as legitimate has remained firm. This, coupled alongside junta demands for the removal of sanctions and the denial of diplomacy until their own recognition, the implications of this announcement are grave. It is possible that the junta may view the elimination of Bazoum, a situation that historically follows charges of high treason, as the only way to force ECOWAS to recognise Chiani and therefore validate his self-appointment as president. The news agency DW would hold an interview with the Prime Minister appointed by the junta, Lamine Zain, in which he suggested that Chiani has been open to diplomacy, but rejected any potential attempt of diplomacy being imposed on them. He followed a call with appreciation for Nigerians that support the coup, and suggested that the new government had acted according to the will of the people. As evidenced by the coups in neighbouring countries, the junta is likely trying to instate a transitional period, that which the new leaders agree with ECOWAS a timescale for return to democracy in exchange for the lifting of sanctions, with the coup leaders recently announcing a 3-year period for the transition back to civilian governance. Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea are all currently experiencing transitional governing and are approaching halfway through the agreed upon 2 years. The economic sanctions placed on Niger are starting to take their toll on the people. Continuous blackouts have been observed thanks to the cutting of electricity from neighbour Nigeria. On top of this, the halt of government aid from Western countries will be having a devastating impact, thanks to this making up roughly half of Niger's yearly budget. This has made the removal of sanctions imperative to the junta, although they remain unwilling to relinquish power to achieve that. This incredible impasse has created the conditions wherein the region now finds itself at the cliff's edge of war. Nigeria, whose president is the current head of ECOWAS, would likely spearhead any intervention due to them having the lion's share of personnel and defence spending. It seems on paper that the Nigerians would be the likely victor, but when taking into account the difference in levels of defence spending in relation to GDP, it is clear that the rebellious suspended members have been paying far more attention to military matters. The anti-France agenda appears to be at the centre of the popular support for the coup, and although it has genuine support, the existence of Russian disinformation campaigns is evidenced by some of the rhetoric used by both the Nigerian government and its people. In spite of this, support for democracy remains amongst the populace, with genuine improvements to both the GDP of the country and the impact of jihadist activity in recent months. Previous Tuareg rebel leader Rissa Agbullah formed the Council for Resistance for the Republic and stated the intention to return Bazoum to the presidency, as well as supporting the intervention of ECOWAS. In a statement released alongside the founding of the council by the ousted Nigerian presidential advisor, they expressed their dismay at the actions of Chiani by stressing that the betrayal paved the way for the unspeakable actions of the commander of the Presidential Guard, whose primary duty is to ensure the security of the president, and would lay out in detail the negative impact the coup has had on the country and its people. The developing situation has now caught the wider attention of the African Union, with the Union holding a crisis meeting at its Ethiopia headquarters to discuss plans to address the rebellion. With them having previously given its support for ECOWAS and expressed the desire to see democracy restored, the Union would eventually object to the right of the regional bloc to invade. It is impossible to give an affirmative answer on what happens next, but by observing recent events and the official positions of the involved parties, it is hard to see how this would end without a conflict. ECOWAS has made a threat and given an ultimatum, which has given the organisation little room to manoeuvre, and although the decision to attack has some official support, it appears to be unpopular among members of government and the West African people. After Tinubu's request to his government, the Senate rebuked him, and many member nations are yet to even bring the issue to their respective parliaments. War on a nation-to-nation scale would be devastating, but deciding now not to intervene calls into question the authority and the validity of ECOWAS and its ability to have an impact on diplomacy. Such an event would likely bring around the end of the bloc and has the potential to cause yet more coups, so how they decide to proceed is imperative to regional stability going forwards.